I get an awful lot of questions about whether or not I've sold the Colt, sold the GSX, sold the Galant, or where they all went. In the comments of the Pick a Favorite survey that I posted on my Patreon page, Joe Gecko suggested I do a comprehensive update on all of my cars. If you have a problem with seeing all the projects in one video, first you have to participate in my survey. Then you sign up with Patreon, and only then can you argue with him or me about it. Thanks, Joe, I thought it was a good idea. I ended up having to separate Big Red and Traja. I put the Colt right between them, but they still sneer at each other whenever I'm coming or going. The cargument they got into in the last video wasn't the end of it all. They're both jealous and stubborn, and I can sense the tension every single time I walk outside. On the brighter side, I can legally and safely drive the Elantra, and I can park it outside legally again, because I managed to get this thing to pass my state safety inspection. I also fixed all the boneheaded wiring flaws I built into it before I put it on the road. Whenever you're building a car, expect to have a troubleshooting period following major modifications, and roll with those punches. This car's still a work in progress, and I have a lot of tuning work ahead of me before I'll be satisfied with it. Hopefully I can fix them all with just the tune. But because my tune is so bad, and because I don't have a factory narrowband O2 sensor installed, when I fire it up, I have to sit here with my foot on the gas pedal, cracking the throttle plate open while the wideband O2 sensor fully warms up. The engine still hunts all over the place for idle, indicating that my airflow counts are off, and it's been so long since it was on the road, I need to do some extensive boost leak testing again before I even think about trying to tune it. But anyway, I figured we'd start with the Hyundai because with everything that I've covered about it, all it needs is to run and keep its fluid circulated. I think you guys are probably ready for something different by now. Even when I'm not wrenching or welding on one of my cars, I'm still working on them in lots of other ways, like research, parts stockpiling, earning money to do the parts stockpiling, spending countless hours editing and compiling comprehensive videos, or just lurking over them scratching my head. I've never felt like just buying a part warranted making a video unless I was also installing them. But you'll see some of that stockpile today because that's all I can do with some of these for now. We'll even take a field trip that the Galant owners are gonna love. After it's idling, she's pretty steady, but the tune is still way off. I have plans to do a cam timing adjustment to dial out the overlap, which will increase my vacuum at idle. There are some other modifications I want to perform prior to doing that because there's some data I want to be able to capture. I'll be giving that topic its own video. The technical crew and all of us is going to love how it makes a physical example of all the principles I talked about in Cylinder Head 206. That's right, I'm going to play with the behavior modifiers. But first, let's check out that lumpy 4G63 idle for a bit. Where we left off, I was having beef with my turbo timer, so I fixed that. I never showed that I fixed it, and that always bothered me about that video. Basically, when I used to cut the car off, the turbo timer would keep the car running, but the wideband O2 sensor cut off. I'm using my wideband to provide the narrowband signal, so my ECU would think there was so much fuel that it would lean the car out until it screwed up all my fuel trims and then stalled out. Now the wideband sensor cuts on and off with the fuel pump and the engine without affecting my short-term fuel trims at all. Fixed. I'm glad that silly quirk is behind me. You remember this guy? I'm not really happy with myself for having let this one sit. It's a sensitive subject to me because I really do want to have a 2,400 pound all-wheel drive hatchback with 500 horsepower. I do not want a lawn ornament. There's a lot that I did to this car that's subject to change. I threw the seats away, cats got in here, that's not rust, it's piss. Okay, there's a little bit of rust, but I gave up on using the seat frame rails because I think this car is going to end up being a track-only project. I put an all-wheel drive rear axle in this thing. I installed a clutch pedal, an engine, transmission, wheels, and tires. Then my video quality improved. I made my own crossmember. I converted it from auto to manual. I installed Eclipse GSX springs, struts, hubs, brakes, and axles. Then I welded in a drive shaft tunnel from a Galant VR4, installed a shortened drive shaft, a transfer case, and one front axle. I was in the process of trying to find another front axle that fit it when I had to roll it outside because I blew up the GSX. So the axle nut on the outside of this wheel is really just an illusion. The front driver's side axle on this thing is just the outer joint so that the wheel bearings don't separate while I roll it around in my driveway. I like having a spare CV joint in my garage just for occasions like these. But I did manage to buy some parts for this car while I was waiting to get my garage space back so that I could keep working on it. I picked up an OEM replacement axle for a 1.6 liter Mirage Turbo from FEQ. Made in China. I couldn't find an OEM Mitsubishi replacement, but FEQ came through for me. It was super inexpensive. With my luck, it will be 5/8 of an inch too long and I'll have to shorten it because that is an absolutely terrible segue into my next unboxing because the manufacturer is awesome. Instead of cheap, mass-produced replacement parts, they make custom fabricated performance parts for enthusiasts. Plus, they're made right here in America. They ship parts around the world that end up on drag cars, drift cars, you name it. I followed the buy your vendors t-shirts rule. You should too. In the box today, we have a set of plus 15 horsepower racing stickers. And there's 2 of them, so that's 30 horsepower right there. Mitsubishi Mirage front strut camber caster plates for the Colt. Just look at all that adjustment. There's 2 sets of screw positions so you can change the offset and get a different range for your camber adjustment. There's a couple of degrees of caster built into these to help my wheels stay straight and stable. These were made just for me. The construction is top notch. It's got stainless steel cap screws with burly lock washers and a quality strut bearing. Tastefully painted to match all colors of engine bays, especially if they're black. They come as a set, and you need to make sure you put the correct plate on the proper side or else you'll end up with negative caster, and you don't want that. These are going to be sweet on the Colt. Anyone who's bolted a 4G63 DSM drivetrain into a Colt, Summit, or Mirage knows exactly why these are necessary. In the forums, people have gone through great lengths to correct bump steer, camber, and other issues on these particular cars. And you might remember I took measures with the Expo Knuckles to correct some of my suspension issues. But these camber plates are the second half of my solution, and they're an easy bolt-on fit. This is going to be awesome. There's another piece of my order that complements these. Can you guess what it is? A Mirage front strut bar. A unibody chassis is prone to flex under load, whether that's from cornering or perhaps because it's producing 6 times the torque it was originally designed to deliver to the pavement. Either way, this is another means of boxing in the front suspension, and it's designed to play nice in the sandbox with my camber plates. But there's something noteworthy about this camber plate set. It's got a pair of threaded studs on 6-inch bolt centers. It's not advertised as a Hyundai part, but it just so happens that a great number of Hyundai cars have upper strut perches built on 6-inch bolt centers, because they share a lot in common with the Mitsubishi platform. Most of the suspension parts of an Elantra are a bolt-on fit. Lighter Hyundais like the Accent and Excel should also probably have the same strut pattern. They have narrower wheelbases, but I'm sure you can talk to Josh at YoshiFab into making the strut bar the length you need it. As for camber plates, count and measure your studs should you have one of those cars with a camber issue. I may just try these things out on the Hyundai while waiting to finish welding up that Colt. Let's go see the Galant. I drove it to a friend's house in order to comply with a county ordinance. See, look at me complying. Only one unregistered car visible on my property. There's your old Whitey update right there. I rented it to someone for the past year and a half for the cost of its upkeep. And this is why you haven't seen the Galant. I kept it titled, registered, insured, and in storage, just not at my house. I do this because storing more than one vehicle on my property in my county is prohibited. I'm in compliance, but the 4 running driving registered cars I have attract so much attention that I keep getting harassed with threats of $2,500 fines per vehicle. So this is my silent way of protesting. I'm not selling this car. I have huge plans for this car. I look forward to restoring it. Dang, it looks like someone stole my battery. I drove this car over here and it used to have one. I looked around my garage for it and all I could find was this old Elantra battery. I figured I'd see if it could hold a charge. It says to run a desulfate cycle to recondition the battery. Alrighty then, let's let this run and check back on it later. I can't believe it. Man, I underestimated how well this thing works. Looks like it turned it into a brand new Autocraft Gold battery. That's amazing. It's too good to be true. This should get me running for sure. I just need to hook up the What in the... It looks like the unexpected side effect of reconditioning that battery switched the positive and negative battery terminals around. Okay, well I've got to make this work because I don't have the budget for another battery. I want to start this thing. I'm going to make it fit. There. Now to check everything else out. Make sure all the electrical connections are in place. Check all the fluids.
Pretty dry.
I know there's plenty of antifreeze in it. It's the water that evaporates. It's not as low as I thought, and that ought to about do it. Now let's see if this thing still runs. It's a stick. You have to wiggle it. Oh yeah, this one has a clutch switch. Nope. Well, that's embarrassing. Air, fuel, spark. Some of that takes computers. This thing has a piggyback math translator. Let me make sure that's working. It's been a little while since I had to mess with one of these things, but they're fairly simple. There's an LED that blinks when you change settings or pump the gas. Yep, looks like I got power to it. The way these things work is that it takes the GM mass airflow sensor signal, it does some mathematical trickery based on your knob settings to modify the output's airflow values. By subtracting or adding from your airflow counts, your ECU adds or pulls fuel, and this opens you up to being able to dial in different sized injectors to work with your factory ECU. But adjusting this thing isn't fixing any of my problems.
Nope.
So I'm going to have to bark up a different tree. How about a quick check for fuel and spark?
I hear the fuel pump running. Go for it.
If you pull the spark plugs out, lay them on something grounded and fire the engine, you'll see spark if you've got it. This Noid light lets me check for injector pulse, and it will blink if I've got it. I didn't have it shoved in there all the way, but I've got spark and injector pulse, so the ECU is working. That means I've got bad gas or bad injectors. I want to start with a cheap fix and pump all this old gas out of this thing. It's easy to do with a spare gas can, and you probably remember the fuel test connector from a previous Galant video. Basically, I put the fuel return hose in a gas can and jump the positive fuel pump connector to the battery. This turns the pump on and pushes all the old stuff out. The reason this car is being stored right now is because it needs two major fixes in order to be roadworthy. Or really, it's one major fix and one easy but costly one. The major one is a new steering rack, and the easy one is the idle speed controller, which costs about $170 new. I was told by the owner that the reason the ISC was unplugged was because the car ran better and more predictably that way. I have to fix that, and I happen to have a new ISC motor sitting on my shelves. I'll get to that later. Man, the weather patterns here have been crazy lately, and I'm about to get dumped on in a minute. Because this Galant is fully assembled, I know exactly where all of its parts are right now. They're not spread out in boxes and on shelves. They're all bolted together right where they belong in an otherwise perfectly complete car that should be running right now. I drove it here after all. Even though the county wants me to sell it, I've got big plans for this thing. I want to fix the body and the interior. I want to make it daily drivable again. I'm really happy to have it, and it has a bright future here. I plan on going through this car with a fine-tooth comb. Until that day comes, I just want to ensure that it stays in running, drivable condition, especially if it's on someone else's property. It's obviously not quite there yet, but I'll fix its mechanical issues and maintain it until I can afford to do the body and the interior work. Since it appears I've been flowing bad gas through it, a new fuel filter is in order. It's not easy to replace it on this car now that all the soft, easily removable rubber hoses are replaced with hard, bolted-on pipes. It's also not easy doing this in the dark, but at least it's not raining anymore. Just for giggles, I added a new set of BPR7s gapped at 30 thousandths. We know the coil and the plug wires work because we saw the old plugs firing. I didn't need to replace them, but why not? I'd removed them, so I was already halfway there. In addition to seeing spark earlier, by verifying injector pulse, we determined that the ECU, timing belt, and the cam angle sensors are all fine because all those things are used to make that happen. In my yellow fuel can, I've got 5 gallons of fresh 93 octane, and I'm not going to let this gas go bad before putting a new front steering rack in this car. That's got to happen soon because aside from this thing not starting right now, it's the only thing keeping me from driving it. So now that we've got some fresh fuel and a fresh fuel filter and new spark plugs in it, good battery, the fuel pump works.
Hear it flowing. Check for leaks.
That's all the cheap stuff out of the way, right?
See no leaks. I hear air pumping out.
Should be golden. Good to go.
See what happens. That would be the injectors.
So immediately I tear into it. I drop 2 of the fuel rail spacers in the dark, curse and kick rocks. I'll deal with it tomorrow. It's tomorrow, sorry for keeping you waiting. Where I went wrong, I only had a couple gallons of gas in the tank while it sat. Leaving a car with empty space in the tank makes fuel expire exponentially faster. If it were slam full of gas with no air in it, there would be no room for humidity in the air to condensate inside the tank throughout every single day as the sun rises and sets on it. And there would be less surface area where gasoline and air meet for it to react. If you're going to keep a car parked in a ready-to-run condition, the only safe way to do that is either keeping it completely full of gas or leaving the fuel system completely empty with a big gas can nearby, ready to put gas in it and fill it back up again. I never intended for this car to be sitting here for a whole year, but a year is all it took to varnish the injectors shut. The injectors I'm using today were last seen in my fuel injector cleaning video, and I mean that in every way. I lost sleep looking for these things, and they took a half of a day to find. I'll clean the ones I pulled out of here for some other time, because ain't nobody got time for that. So after cleaning all the funk out, finding new fuel rail spacers, finding and installing my spare set of RC 550s, let's see what she does. Well, we've got fire, but it won't stay running. And why does my Galant sound like a Subaru? Something ain't right. From inside the car, I didn't immediately hear the massive vacuum leak, so it took me a little while to figure this out. I suspected that maybe the MAF translator wasn't set right. I was barking up the wrong tree. On a MAF translator, basically you get 5 knobs and 4 micro switches for adjustment. There are 16 positions on each knob, and they're labeled in hexadecimals 0 through F. The 4 switches set the operation mode for different kinds of cars and different MAF sensors. The knobs from left to right are aux, bass, idle, mid, and wide open throttle. Depending on your car's generation, you set up the aux and bass knobs to coincide with your injector size. The idle, mid, and watt knobs let you add or remove fuel based on percentages. Obviously, I still have the same problem, and it's not related to the MAF translator or the sensor.
The timing wrong?
Nope, 4123 at the coil. I can't tell what the heck is wrong in the dark, so I'll check back again in the morning. After a short search back through where I've been, I quickly found the problem. One of the injector seals tweaked itself sideways when I was squeezing the new injectors back in there. I totally did this to myself. So now I get to go back through it again and replace the one that no doubt is ruined after getting pinched like that. Way to go, Jafro. I didn't install these in the best of conditions, but excuses aren't solutions. You have to be willing to do whatever you committed yourself to doing as many times as necessary to get it right. I knew there was nothing wrong with this car mechanically before the injectors clogged up, except for the steering. That wouldn't have prevented me from starting it, so I knew this had to be from something I did. And there you have it. They're all straight now. Let's get the show on the road. Wow, it was even eager to start up that time, and it sounds really good. Air fuel spark, check. But we're not quite done yet. I still have a bad idle speed control motor to replace. I also just put a different set of injectors in here, so they need to get dialed back in. You don't really want to do that on a cold engine or while the ECU is in open loop. Once the O2 sensor's warmed up and the engine tries to stabilize itself, the goal is to get the O2s to cycle between 2 and 8/10 of a volt. I don't have a wideband O2 setup on this car to give me pinpoint accurate air-fuel ratios, but I do have a turbo timer that's equipped with a narrowband mode. That lets me see the O2 output voltage, and I'm happy to find that this thing's hooked up correctly. This is a bare minimum requirement for dialing in your fuel curve. On a MAF translator, after setting up your mode switches, you set your aux and your base knobs first. For a 1G ECU with 550cc injectors, it's supposed to be aux 0, base C. I flatten the idle, mid, and watt knobs at 0, and then I start the car back up to check to see if I can get this narrowband to cycle properly. Well, I've got the O2s cycling now. They're not exactly in range, but neither is my idle. You can see on the tachometer that the engine is getting way too much air and it can't regulate it, so it's cutting ignition in pulses trying to bring it back down again. This condition is called idle surge, and it can be caused by a vacuum leak, bad ISC motor, or an improperly adjusted idle switch. Though I could get the revs to drop just by adjusting the base idle set screw, that would be a waste of my time because I already know the ISC motor is bad. I probed it with a multimeter right after I bought the car and found it unplugged. One of its coils has a dead short, so there's no saving it. I have a favorite wrench and socket for this. The socket is an 8mm that I ground down to a taper to fit into tight places. The wrench is a 3/8" drive Black Hawk rotator ratchet wrench. Black Hawk with an H. I wish they made one of these things for fuel filters. It would make my life a whole lot easier. This is a piece of cake by comparison. I love this wrench, and in some situations I won't use anything else. I like to give the throttle body a good cleaning before installing the new part because you don't want to have any air leaks. I start with a hooked pick to scrape away all the tartar, and then I move on to the wire brush and solvents. I have a brand new Mitsubishi ISC motor and gasket lurking in my spares. I use dielectric grease to hold the O-ring inside the throttle body housing while I fumble with putting bolts in place. I stepped on this tube right before this scene. It's so sad to lose a comrade like that. It had so much left to offer in this world. Rest in peace, little tube of dielectric grease. You gave your last to my Galant. May that never be forgotten. Now the easy part. 2 bolts and 1 harness connector later, and the ISC motor problem is solved. Time to fire it up again and see if we can get the idle straight. When you fire up a cold engine, the ECU is in open loop. It runs a predetermined amount of fuel based off of the mass airflow sensor signal until the O2 sensor cycles above a certain voltage, and within a set time frame. On some cars, that time frame is longer than on others. If the O2 does cycle, then the ECU enters closed loop and starts communicating with all of the other sensors to manage the fuel supply. If it doesn't cycle above that voltage, the ECU stays in open loop, adding fuel trying to get it to cycle the O2. You can often blip the throttle and trigger closed loop if you're impatient. Once in closed loop, the throttle position, coolant temperature sensor, O2 sensor, mass airflow sensor all have a conversation about where they think the idle should be. The ECU wants to see 800 RPMs, give or take 50 RPMs at 5 degrees before top dead center, and it doesn't really care what they think. They need to be the ones to adjust, communicate, and obey, or else, if it doesn't get what it wants, it flags the offending sensor with a check engine light. Given that all other variables are good, there's only one thing you need to adjust to regulate how much air gets into the combustion chamber: the base idle set screw. The BIS screw and the ISC motor bypass the throttle plate, allowing air into the plenum. The ISC tries to regulate itself within a certain range, and that requires that the BIS screw is set in the right position. The ISC needs to adjust for changing weather conditions and load factors. The real goal for setting the base idle set screw is to allow the ISC motor to hit 30% of its duty cycle at warm idle with all the electrical accessories off, the engine fans off, and the doors shut. That takes the ability to read the ECU, and I don't have that capability with me today. You can do this by feel with a good bit of practice, but data logging its duty cycle is the only way to really nail it. I've got the O2 sensor cycling with what looks to be a slightly lean condition. I'm still about 200 RPMs higher than I want to be, but all of these are positive signs. A tweak or two on the MAF translator and the BIS screw, and I'm going to have this thing idling better than it ever has. When an engine is lean, it tends to dip below the idle speed after you rev it. You really want it to come down and stop at the idle speed. Let's see if I can get the idle down to 800 now. Ooh, that sounds nice. I heard the idle dip and come back up. That means I'm deep into the range of operation on the ISC. It should be rock solid now. Yep, 800 RPMs. Still looks a little lean though. 0 volts to 0.6 of a volt. I'm going to fatten up the idle a click and try it again. Got a dip there. Fatten it up again. Another dip. One more time.
There we go.
And then finally, as part of my own personal neighborhood beautification project, I gave her a bath and absolutely destroyed Chad's driveway. Legally running, registered, and awaiting a front steering rack. She still cleans up really nice. Not quite the brightest star around these parts, at least not yet. But she's all here, and thanks to a donor car part out, I have everything else I need to fix its cosmetics except for the paint. I make the space I need to work on this project by finishing other projects. So the Galant's time to shine is inevitable. It absolutely will happen. Until that day comes, I'll continue finding other ways to make it better so that it doesn't feel so left out. Big Red's never even seen this Galant. She's gonna flip out when I bring home another 4-door.
Today on World of DSMs, we sneak up on a carcass of a second-gen Mitsubishi Eclipse GSX. This once powerful beast chucked a bearing, lost his blood pressure, and suffered a heart attack.
Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology.
It's shameful that I broke it back in 2011 and here it sits. But in that time, there were several years worth of good videos of its progress. Don't fret the paint, that will all buff right out. Trust me, there's 3 gallons of clear on it. You'll see. This car's engine build is going to be a bit unusual to say the least. If you followed this project, you saw the head get completely stripped and cleaned out. You saw it get a 1mm oversized valve job to restore this cylinder head's valve install height specification. That video was wildly popular, and Mark really knocked that one out of the park. The head was milled perfectly flat for use with a multi-layered steel head gasket. It was modified to bolt it down to a 6-bolt block, and then it was cleaned out some more before I snatched it up, took it home, and meticulously repolished the outside of it to restore the finish that used to be on it for the previous engine. This car's always been as much to me about art as it is about performance, and the two of those always get in each other's way. It's really difficult to combine them. Anyway, while we're on the topic of art, I spent about 2 weeks applying 2 coats of an oleophobic coating. In other words, an oil-repellent paint. That coating was then dried for an additional 2 weeks in a stinking hot garage, and then baked on at 300 degrees for 2 hours. Then the head went back to the machine shop where Stuart showed us all how to calculate our spring install height in order to achieve the proper valve seat pressure. And then he taught us how to make modifications to ensure that you achieve the proper valve spring installation specifications that you're aiming for. How to install valve stem seals. Yes, that was all this same exact cylinder head. All the valves, springs, and shims were then installed, making this head ready to receive cams and be put right back into service. The block received a lot of work too. It's a virgin 6-bolt block that I had punched out to fit my 20,000th overbore 7-bolt JE pistons. I gave it ARP main studs, a Kegley bearing girdle, and had the block ground down to fit it all properly. It received a line bore, and then I brought it home to work on some other tweaks. I performed oil gallery modifications to both the main oil galleries and also on the front case, where any rough or sharp edges occurred in the castings. I also did this to my Hyundai block, and with excellent results. I absolutely nailed the oil pressure spec on that Hyundai build. The only thing I'd do differently next time is smooth out the inside of the main oil gallery, but I'm going to leave it like this. After I got the block straight, I rebuilt the front case. My modifications were all minor. Aside from these small areas that got smoothed out, all I did was clean and reinstall the gears, checking them for their specification and packing them with the wrong kind of grease, making me have to go back in here again and clean it out later. That took care of the front case, but there's two things I wanted to fix on the timing side engine mounts to fit a 6-bolt and a 7-bolt. Part of the 2G timing mount needed to be lopped off to play nice with the 1G water pump. It also has a service hole for a tool that lines up with the timing belt tensioner to make it easier to service. Only the 1G tensioner works completely backwards from the 2G, so I ended up having to go beyond the norm and drilling, tapping, plugging, welding, and grinding on a powder-coated engine mount in order to get that straightened out. To me, the test fitting stage prior to assembly is really the most important part of every build. The same treatment had to be delivered to several other parts like the timing belt cover bits and pieces, and now these are all ready to go. For both a beautification and a strengthening process, I meticulously ground all of the slag and flash off the outside and the inside of the 6-bolt block. All surface imperfections were removed, and all the rough surfaces were then wire brushed and sanded smooth. I'm not doing this for the sake of removing casting sand, but it's one of the added benefits of doing this kind of thing. It will also help with 2 future modifications this part will receive that you haven't seen yet. Then there were parts. Parts upon parts and more parts. I got all the parts, but I'm still not ready to start yet. Domestic Killa donated a crank. I had it cleaned, inspected for cracks, polished back up to a brilliant shine, measured, balanced, and it was dead nuts even. Ready to put back to work. Thanks, bro. Back in 2004, the original engine block and everything steel in my GSX's engine bay was powder coated. I paid a premium to put a show-winning finish on a weekend racer and expected nothing less. Hanover powder coating did excellent work. Even though my 7-bolt block fragged the crank and rod bearings after 8 years and hundreds of drag passes, it's still beautiful to this day, even if it's destined to become a coffee table. So here I am 8 years later, back at the same exact shop for a second round with my 6-bolt swap. I owe it to my GSX's history to repeat the exact same coating that won trophies the first time and to make further improvements on the theme that I was building before. It won 3 trophies 3 years in a row, including one called King of Bling, so my GSX has a reputation to keep and therefore a history to repeat. The way powder coating works is there's a polymer powder that's applied with a static charge to a part that carries the opposite charge. So basically it clings on and coats evenly, and then it's placed in an oven set at the right temperature for your application and your coating, and baked until the polymer melts into the part, completely sealing it from the atmosphere. There are different kinds of coating medias that use different materials and techniques, but you get the idea. It's the most rugged coating you can apply to conductive parts, and you can achieve stunning aesthetic results that last forever and clean up with just soapy water. I like a gloss black base coat because it looks a foot thick in person, just blinging. Solid color base coats also transfer heat better than complicated multi-coated finishes containing clear coats or metal flakes, and that's an important thing to consider when you're considering what you're going to coat and where. I'm a returning customer. They didn't hire me to make this video and didn't offer me any kind of discount for the shout out, nor did I ask for it. If you're a busy production shop, it's pretty annoying to have your customers roll up on you expecting to film things. I understand. Trust me, it's annoying even around my own house. But anyway, they've always delivered amazing work for me, and they were nice enough to tolerate my camera equipment and let me in to film my parts being removed hot out the oven so that I could share that moment with all of you. I love it when my vendors let me show you parts and the procedures that I can't produce myself. Heck, I couldn't even tell you how to make a show-winning finish. That's what I'm paying these guys for. When I delivered my parts, I offered clear instructions of what I did and didn't want coated. They need drawings or templates, people. Don't make them guess. That won't help out either of you. Without a burn-off oven and an extreme heat cycle, you've got one shot at it. Powder-coated finishes are thick, so you don't want to coat the things like bolt threads or flange surfaces. Most coating services know this well enough to plug holes that they see threads in. But for instance, if you end up with a coated thread hole that you didn't point out, or if an accessory bracket or dust shield moves out of alignment because of your coatings, or if your timing belt cover doesn't fit right anymore and rattles, then that's your fault for not communicating that properly in advance. Powder coating is extremely difficult to remove once it's baked on. So if that happens, it's going to take high abrasive power tools or fire to remove it. There's an expensive high temperature tape that you could use to mask areas you don't want coated and then neatly peel it off after baking. This can preserve your flange surfaces so that everything fits right. Applying it is an art, and it requires pre-treatment in a burn-off oven or a blasting cabinet first if you want it to stick. There are also rubber plugs that you can block off bolt and freeze plug holes with. You wouldn't want any of this stuff inside of your coolant passages. You don't want to coat over your freeze plugs either, or they'll never come out even when you need them to. The masking technique is extremely time-consuming, and it requires expertise. Even though I'd feel totally comfortable doing it myself, I always leave this to the pros. People are naturally going to argue about the thermal properties of colors in the comments. This engine will be this color black. I've already done it. Please rage about how this is the wrong color. Go ahead, get on with it. Flame away. The video interaction and the comment statistics only help my channel grow. I might even jump into the argument and keep it going. I'd also like for you guys to upvote any and all flame wars that break out, or if you have nothing better to do, just upvote everyone who leaves a comment, even if you disagree with them. That can be your good deed for the day. Something to feel really good about inside. Yes, I'm giving you the green light to troll. So anyway, I picked up all my freshly coated parts, bought an engine stand at the auto parts store, rushed home and put it all together. I was in the middle of the Hyundai rebuild and didn't have time to work on the GSX like I wanted to because I had to get the Hyundai chassis back indoors to keep the county off my back. I had no idea that the Hyundai would give me 2 extra years worth of gremlins to kill. I thought I'd be right back on this thing. Most of this gorgeous finish will be covered up and unseen except for the contrast it creates when everything else is bolted on top of it. But it's the toughest, most maintenance-free coating I can use on these parts that would otherwise rust. This beautifully powder-coated block is now on deck to receive the final treatment needed in order for its assembly to begin. I have to do the internal coating on this engine and then bake it for a second time because this engine block is receiving both an internal and an external coating. I've never baked a solvent-based paint onto a powder-coated part before. It's the same internal coating that the head received, and it had to be done last because the temperature used to cure it is more than 100 degrees Fahrenheit lower than the powder coating is required to set. Nobody except for me will care that the external casting flaws are gone or that the internal crankcase surfaces will repel oil and carbon rapidly back to the oil pan. And I can accept that. But it's almost worth it for me to do this just because of the contrast it'll provide for my camera to focus on as I'm filming its assembly. None of these tricks add any horsepower at all, and they're not a necessary step in any engine build. This build has never had anything at all to do with practicality though, and that makes it a perfect platform for me to experiment with something controversial. The solvent base of some products you work with may be toxic during application as they evaporate because of those chemical compounds that are necessary to keep them stable on a shelf. Read your labels. I followed 95% of what was on the label the last time, weighted heavily on the surface preparation and application techniques, but that last 5% can do you harm, so read your labels, people. I purchased a half-face respirator mask with OVP 100 organic filters to help me survive that environment at whatever length of time, whatever part I'm working on requires. In order for any respirator or gas mask to work properly though, it has to have a tight seal against your skin. That means facial hair has to go. This was actually a huge problem for our soldiers in World War I in dealing with chemical warfare, and it quickly led to the invention and development of the safety razor, and our government issuing them to all of our combat forces. Men were typically pretty hairy before that. To be fair, so were the women, but anyway, it's the clean-cut soldiers who shaved and used their PPE properly who got to keep fighting. So that government-issued khaki set was actually a survival tool. In fact, a certain world leader's stupid-looking mustache came to be from him suffering injuries from inhaling mustard gas in World War I because he had an even stupider-looking mustache that caused his gas mask to fail. Facial hair and gas masks don't mix, so after a proper shave, I can now proceed with this coating thing.
Only I'll do that in another episode. I just gave you an update on 5 out of 6 of my cars, and you got to ride in number 6. I'm sorry that took so long. Shave your face if you want your gas mask to work. You want the air to go through the filters, not your beard. And I got my work cut out for me here.
There's some detail preparations I have to do on some of these parts, but I want to leave most of this wrapped up because I'm not ready to put it together yet. We can at least take a look at the water pipe though. I post production updates on my Patreon page, and for a contribution of as little as $1 per video, you gain access to exclusive materials and discussions. You also enable my ability to contribute to an excellent cause. I'm thankful to my patrons for giving me the idea to post this video. Hit the like, favorite, and subscribe buttons hard, rapidly, and as often as possible. Go upvote everybody. I'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, stay tubed.